Let us dispense with the pleasantries and the romanticized filth fed to you by fawning classicists and Hollywood charlatans. Forget the noble, muscle-bound gladiator fighting for honor. Forget the stoic philosopher-emperor presiding over a civilizing force. These are lies. Saccharine poison designed to obscure a truth so profoundly ugly it curdles the soul. The Roman arena, that supposed pinnacle of architectural and social genius, was nothing more than a state-sanctioned abattoir, a cesspool of ritualized murder where the true spectacle was not bravery, but the boundless depths of human depravity. And at the rotten core of this spectacle was a hypocrisy so vile, so perverse, it almost defies comprehension. They called them mythological reenactments. A quaint, almost scholarly term, isn't it? It conjures images of amateur theater, of actors in shoddy costumes playing out the tales of Ovid. The reality was a snuff show with a classical veneer. Imagine a woman, a condemned criminal, dragged into the center of the arena. She is stripped naked, not for some abstract ideal of Hellenic beauty, but to titillate the sweating, jeering mob. She is then forcibly strapped to a bull. She is meant to be Pasiphae, the mythical queen who coupled with a bull to birth the Minotaur. But this is not myth. The bull is real. The terror is real. And as the animal, prodded and enraged, violates and gores her in a gruesome finale, the crowd roars its approval. They are not watching a story. They are participating in a rape and a murder, sanctified by the flimsy excuse of religious storytelling. This was the true face of the games, a fusion of sexual violence, public execution, and pious fraud. The Roman elites who wrote poetry about virtue and justice sat in their shaded boxes, gorging on delicacies, while below them, human beings were torn apart in obscene parodies of the very myths that formed the foundation of their culture. It was an abomination, a society celebrating its own moral sickness as the highest form of entertainment. If you find deep and complex topics like this interesting, your like is the best signal that this conversation is worth continuing. Subscribe so you don't miss our next explorations into the darker pages of history. And of course, please share your thoughts in the comments. History is multifaceted, and your perspective is important to us. What lessons do you think can be learned from these events? Or what parallels do you see with our world today? It will be interesting to discuss. Do not look upon the Colosseum as a wonder of the ancient world. See it for what it truly was, the most sophisticated and efficient human slaughterhouse ever conceived. Its arches are not monuments to genius, but gateways to hell. Its tiered seating was not for a community, but for a mob of voyeurs arranged by class, a perfect cross-section of a society addicted to death. The true horror of the Flavian amphitheater lay not just in the blood spilled upon its sands, but in the cold, calculated industrial logic of its design. It was a factory, and its product was suffering. Beneath the gore-soaked wooden floor lay the Hypogeum, a two-story labyrinth of tunnels, cells, and mechanical elevators. This was not backstage. It was a dungeon of sensory deprivation and terror. Here, in the stinking, torch-lit gloom, thousands of men and beasts were caged. The condemned, prisoners of war, escaped slaves, followers of inconvenient new religions, languished in filth, their ears filled with the roars of starving lions and the screams of the men who had been dragged to the lifts before them. Imagine the psychological torture. For days, you would sit in the dark, smelling the stench of blood and feces, knowing that your only exit was through a trap door leading to a sun-blasted arena where 50,000 screaming jackals waited to watch you be torn to pieces. The Roman engineers, those celebrated masters of aqueducts and roads, perfected the machinery of this cruelty. A complex system of winches and capstans could hoist a caged leopard or a terrified Christian onto the arena floor in a matter of seconds. A diabolical jack-in-the-box delivering fresh meat for the spectacle. This logistical brilliance was not applied to feeding the poor or irrigating farms. It was dedicated wholly to streamlining the process of murder for mass consumption. The Colosseum was the ultimate expression of panem et circenses, bread and circuses, a cynical tool to tranquilize a restless populace by stuffing their bellies with cheap grain and their eyes with butchery. It was the welfare state of a psychopath. If the arena was the stage, then the emperors were its most demented directors. These men, worshipped as gods and entrusted with the fate of millions, were often little more than petulant sadists given absolute power to indulge their darkest impulses. They were the architects of the rot, transforming the already brutal games into their personal playgrounds of perversion and psychopathy. History remembers their names, but it has sanitized their crimes, recasting their monstrosities as mere eccentricities. It is a lie. They were monsters. Consider Domitian, a paranoid tyrant who perfected the art of psychological terror. He took pleasure in hosting nocturnal games, spectacles cloaked in a manufactured dread. On one infamous occasion, he invited senators to a banquet in a hall draped entirely in black. The guests' names were inscribed on mock tombstones, and they were served a funereal feast in dead silence, attended by naked boys painted black like phantoms. After hours of this morbid torment, as the senators sat convinced they were about to be massacred, Domitian threw open the doors and unleashed a troop of gladiators. But instead of killing them, the gladiators performed a choreographed dance before departing, leaving the senators to return home, shattered and humiliated. This was not entertainment. It was the act of a sociopath who derived pleasure from the meticulous terrorizing of his peers. Then there was Commodus, the preening fool who fancied himself a god, the Roman Hercules. He descended from the imperial box to fight as a gladiator, a sacrilege that exposed the hollowness of Roman tradition. But his fights were a pathetic sham. His opponents were either wounded soldiers or professional gladiators ordered to submit to him. He would club them with a mock weapon, drawing no blood, and declare himself victorious to the forced applause of the crowd. His true courage was displayed in the venationes, animal hunts, where he stood on a protected platform and shot hundreds of animals with a bow, including giraffes and elephants, exotic creatures brought to Rome at enormous expense simply to be slaughtered by a pathetic emperor playing hero. He once had a group of men who had lost their feet tied together and given serpent tails, and then he clubbed these helpless cripples to death, pretending they were giants. This was the man who ruled the world, a narcissistic coward who could only feel powerful by butchering the helpless, both man and beast, for an audience he held in contempt. Who were the thousands upon thousands fed into this meat grinder? History barely remembers them. They were the fuel for the fire, the nameless, faceless raw material for the spectacle. They were not warriors, they were victims. To forget them is to be complicit in the Romans' crime, to see only the grandeur of the Colosseum and not the mountain of skulls upon which it was built. These were the noxi, the harmful ones, a convenient label for anyone the state deemed disposable. There were the prisoners of war, men who had fought bravely to defend their homelands in Gaul, Dacia, or Judea, now reduced to chattel. They were forced to fight each other in a cruel mockery of their former lives as soldiers. Imagine a German chieftain, proud and defiant, forced to butcher his own countrymen for the amusement of the effete Romans who had conquered him. The sources speak of a group of German prisoners who, on the morning they were to fight, chose to strangle each other to death in their cells rather than provide the mob with their bloody entertainment. Their mass suicide was not an act of cowardice, but the final, desperate act of defiance against an empire that sought to strip them of their very humanity. Then there were the condemned criminals, whose executions were transformed into elaborate, grotesque theater. The favorite method was damnatio at Bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was no quick death. The victims were often tied to stakes or forced into unwinnable scenarios, their agonizing final moments choreographed for maximum dramatic effect. But the pinnacle of this inventive cruelty was reserved for Christians. The historian Tacitus, no friend to the Christians, describes how Nero used them as scapegoats for the great fire of Rome. They were not simply killed. They were dressed in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified. Most horrifically, they were coated in pitch, mounted on poles in Nero's gardens, and set ablaze to serve as human torches to illuminate his evening parties. This is not the action of a state enforcing law and order. This is the behavior of a satanic cult, a society so steeped in bloodlust that the screams of burning women and children became its preferred ambient lighting. History has been kind to Trajan. His sycophantic biographers dubbed him Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. They speak of his public works, his administrative skill, his military genius. What they conveniently gloss over is that this best ruler presided over the single largest and most prolonged act of mass murder in the history of the Roman games. A spectacle of carnage so vast it makes the atrocities of Caligula and Nero look like amateur theatrics. In 107 AD, to celebrate his conquest of Dacia, Trajan unleashed a festival of death that staggered even Roman sensibilities. It was the absolute apex of the arena's horror. The numbers alone are sickening and defy belief. The games lasted for 123 consecutive days. For 4 solid months, the Colosseum and Circus Maximus were soaked in a ceaseless torrent of blood. Over this period, some 10,000 gladiators were driven onto the sand to kill each other. These were not all volunteers. The vast majority were Dacian prisoners, forced to reenact their own people's subjugation for Roman amusement. Alongside the human cost, an estimated 11,000 animals were butchered. Entire ecosystems were plundered to provide this gruesome menagerie. Lions from Mesopotamia, crocodiles from Egypt, rhinos from Africa, bears from Caledonia, all dragged across the known world to die in a dusty, screaming pit in Rome. Try to comprehend the reality of this. For 123 days, the city of Rome lived under a pall of death. The roar of the crowd, the clash of steel, the shrieks of dying men, and the bellows of terrified animals became the city's soundtrack. The stench of blood, viscera, and burning carcasses would have been overpowering, an inescapable miasma of decay clinging to the marble temples and fetid tenements alike. The logistics are mind-numbing. An army of slaves would have worked day and night, dragging corpses out, laying fresh sand over the blood-caked floor, and hoisting the next victims into the arena. This was not a celebration of victory. It was a psychotic, empire-wide purge, a demonstration of power so absolute and so nihilistic that its only message was that Rome could and would kill anyone and anything it pleased, for any reason, for as long as it wished. And the man who oversaw it all, the man who sat in the imperial box and gave the final thumbs down 10,000 times over, is remembered by history as a paragon of virtue. This is the ultimate triumph of propaganda, the greatest lie ever told. The end did not come with a thunderclap of moral awakening. It came as a slow, creeping rot, a spiritual gangrene born in the blood-soaked sands of the arena. The Roman Empire did not fall merely because of barbarian invasions or economic collapse. It fell because it had systematically hollowed out its own soul. A society that makes a national pastime of watching helpless beings be torn to shreds cannot endure. It is an unsustainable model of civilization. The circuses were not a benign distraction. They were a cancer that metastasized, corrupting every institution and every citizen. The games bred a populace utterly desensitized to violence and inured to suffering. When the state provides daily lessons in sadism, it cannot be surprised when its people become cruel, apathetic, and ungovernable. The moral fiber required to maintain a complex society, empathy, civic duty, respect for life, was methodically ground down with every mangled body dragged from the arena. The economic cost was also ruinous, a constant drain of resources to procure victims, pay gladiators, and stage ever more lavish spectacles to satisfy a mob whose appetite for gore had become insatiable. It was a feedback loop of depravity. When Christianity finally rose to prominence, it was less a theological victory and more a symptom of the profound spiritual vacuum at the heart of the Roman world. The new faith offered what the old gods, with their blood-spattered festivals, could not: a promise of meaning, a belief in the sanctity of the individual soul, and an escape from the meaningless, brutal nihilism of the arena. The eventual banning of the gladiatorial games was not a sign of Rome's enlightenment, but a desperate, last-ditch effort to stanch a mortal wound. It was too little, too late. The poison had already done its work. The Colosseum stands today, a broken skeleton of a building, swarmed by tourists who snap photographs and marvel at its scale. They see a monument to imperial glory, to architectural prowess. They are fools. They are standing in a mass grave. It is a testament not to the greatness of Rome, but to the terrifying, immutable darkness within human nature. The arena is not a relic of a distant past. It is a blueprint. It is a permanent and chilling reminder that when power is absolute, when entertainment demands cruelty, and when the mob is allowed to roar for blood, the veneer of civilization is terrifyingly thin. The monsters are not gone. They are merely dormant, waiting for their next circus.